There we go. Recording in progress. Okay, and we're going to go live now.
Perfect. Dan, I think you're still on microphone.
There we go. Enjoy.
Shall I kick us off?
Perfect.
Fabulous. Hi, everyone. My name's Keris Way. I'm the Regional Political and Equality Officer for GMB Union in the West Midlands. Thanks so much for joining us, whether you're on the Zoom or whether you're on the Facebook. Hi, everyone. That's always very disturbing to hear my own voice. It reminds me that I don't really like it very much, but apologies to the rest of you having to listen to it all the time. So I'm joined by my GMB colleagues, Stuart Richards, who I'll let introduce himself now.
Hi, everybody. I'm Stuart Richards. I'm a senior organiser for GMB in the West Midlands, and I occasionally help Keris quite badly with our LGBT network, GMB Proud.
Thanks, Stuart. And I'm also joined by my colleague, Christina Dearlove.
Hi, I'm Christina Dearlove. I'm one of the LGBT plus people that sits on the Regional Equality Forum.
Thanks, Christina. So GMB Union is a trade union. We represent all workers. We're a general union, so you can join us regardless of what workplace you're in. And in the West Midlands, GMB Proud is our LGBT plus organising group for LGBT plus workers. We do lots of events, campaigns and activities throughout the year to support LGBT workers in their workplaces and also to change legislation and make the workplace and society a better place for LGBT plus workers. So today we're going to talk to you a little bit about rights at work, your employment rights, what you can learn from us and why you should join a trade union. So my colleagues will be taking those sections as well. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. That's what we're here for, to support you. We're going to kick off with, if anybody's ever been to anything I've done before, I love a quiz. I'm a huge fan of a quiz. This is not a test in any way, it's just to have a little bit of fun. So whether you're watching live or you're going to watch afterwards, just test yourself and see how well you do. So I'm going to kick us off with a quiz. And then I'm going to hand over to my colleague Stuart to talk a little bit about employment law. So we've got a couple of questions, just 8. So what I'll do is I'll run through each of the questions. Each of them are multiple choice. Just make a little note and then I'll go through the answers afterwards and we'll see how everybody did. Feel free again to comment and say what you got or to put your answers forward in the comment section if you want to as well. So question number 1. The Equality Act 2010 mentions 9 areas of unlawful discrimination. So that's 9 areas that are unlawful discriminate against. But what are they known as? Are they equality strands? B, diversity dimensions? C, unfairness grounds? Or D, protected characteristics? So that's A, equality strands, B, diversity dimensions, C, unfairness grounds, or D, protected characteristics. Actually, I might share my screen so that you can all see them as well. That might make it a better thing. So let me share that as well, so that it's on the recording for later as well. So that was question number 1. Which one of these? I think we're getting some comments in the chat. That's fantastic. I'll do the answers at the end, but please feel free to keep commenting and having a go at home. So number 2. And which of these is not an area of discrimination? So we've just said there are 9 categories mentioned in the Equality Act 2010. So which of these is not? Is it A, hair colour, B, disability, C, age, or D, marriage? So that's A, hair colour, B, disability, C, age, or D, marriage.
Keris, have you got a countdown clock? Because, you know, this would just work so well with that.
This is my radio voice. That's what's happening now. Yeah. Somebody sing it. Okay, number 3. When did the Stonewall riots take place? So is it A, 1913, B, 1948, C, 1969, or D, 1995? Now I just have a countdown stuck in my head, so thanks so much, Stuart. That's really Okay, question number 4. Section 28 of the Local Government Act was enacted in May 1988. But how long was it around for? So is it A, 30 years, B, 15 years, C, 2 years, or D, 5 years? Feel free to keep putting your comments in the chat. And if you're watching after the fact, just make a note and see if you're right when we get to the answers. So that's how long was Section 28 of the Local Government Act around for? A, 30 years, B, 15 years, C, 2 years, or D, 5 years? All right, question number 5. What is the name of the 2014 film which depicts the real-life group LGSM raising money for the 1984 miners' strike? Is it A, Lesbian and Gays Support the Miners? If you're right when we get to the answer. B, Stop Closing Our Pits, C, Mining for Equality, or D, Pride? If you haven't seen this film, when we get to the answers, because I was just about to say it, that would ruin it, you should definitely watch it. It's a fantastic film, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So that's the 2014 film that depicts the real life group LGSM raising money for the 1984 miners' strike. Question 6. This is a trade union related question. What year was the Trade Union Act adopted, which legalized unions in the UK? So prior to this, it was illegal to be a member of a trade union. So was it A, 1798, B, 1836, C, 1871, or D, 1921? This is actually just a test for Stuart more than anything else.
Will Stuart get it right is the question.
So that's what year was the Trade Union Act adopted? A, 1798, B, 1836, C, 1871, or D, 1921? All right, question 7. The original Pride flag, created in 1978, included 3 colours that no longer exist on the flag today. But what were they? Was it A, pink, turquoise, and indigo? B, pink, gold, and silver? C, gold, silver, and black, or D, grey, black, and turquoise? So there are 3 colours that were on the original flag that are no longer a part of our flag. Although obviously there are many updated versions of the flag as well, but when the original Pride flag was created in 1978, it had 3 extra colours. And the final question is, in which decade was the first strike action in support of, I apologise, in support of a gay worker facing dismissal in the UK? So was it in the 1950s, the 1970s, the 1990s, or the 2010s? So when was the first strike to support a gay worker who was facing dismissal for being gay? So just in case you aren't aware of what strike action is, a gay worker was dismissed for being gay, and other members of that workplace stopped working and went out on strike. So that is the whole quiz. So we shall see how well you all did. I'll run through the answers and obviously just mark off if you've written it down, or feel free in the comments to say, yes, I got that right, or, oh no, that one stumped me. So number 1. The Equality Act mentions 9 areas of unlawful discrimination, and they are known as protected characteristics. So this is the true test. Stuart, what are the 9 areas of protected characteristics?
Thank you very much. Right, so
the
actually, 9 areas.
Don't do them yet. Sorry, my apologies. I'm going to ask you in the second question. I nearly ruined a question then. So if you got D, congratulations. The Equality Act mentions 9 protected characteristics. So question number 2 is, which one of these areas is not a protected characteristic? Hair color, disability, age, or marriage? The answer is hair color. Disability, age, and marriage are 3 of the 9. Now I'm going to ask Stuart to tell you what the other 6 are.
Thank you very much, and I'll try my best, but I always get it wrong. So we've got 3 that Carys has already mentioned. We also have sexual orientation. We have gender reassignment. We have race and ethnicity. We have religion or philosophical belief. We have 2 more. Oh my gosh, no. Oh gosh, Kerry, so you're gonna have to fill in the gaps for me. What have I missed?
The other ones are pregnancy, and I have actually forgotten which ones you've already said. So this was a great start, wasn't it? So let me just check. So we have 9 are age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion and belief, sex, and sexual orientation. Are all protected characteristics under the law. You cannot be discriminated against based on those areas since the Equality Act of 2010. Right, when did the Stonewall riots take place? In 1969. So for those of you who don't know, the Stonewall riots essentially were a riot that broke out in New York after police raided a local gay bar and tried to arrest patrons of that bar. A riot broke out and a fight with the police, which ensued in several weeks of action, which many people consider to be the first ever Pride. And a year later, a remembrance was held to mark the anniversary, which is again considered to be this first sort of Pride parade. But just so everybody's aware, those other days are pretty significant as well. 1913 is the year that Emily Davison died, she was a suffragette. She died after throwing herself in front of the King's horse. Whether she intended to die or not is up for debate, but she did. 1948 is the arrival of the Empire Windrush, which many of you will have heard in the news over the last few years. There's a lot of controversy around the Windrush generation, and 1995 is the year that the Disability Discrimination Act was brought in. So if any of those dates ring a bell for you on another count, that's what those are. So number 4, section 28 of the Local Government Act came around in 1988. And how long did it last for? If you put B, 15 years, you were correct. It came in 1988 under a Tory government, and it went out in 2003 under a Labour government. It took a long time for this to go away. And essentially, if you don't know what Section 28 was, it was a policy that stopped the promotion of homosexuality in council authorities, so that includes schools and any services that supported LGBT plus people, which meant many teachers had to go back into the closet. Anyone at school that was LGBT was not allowed to be supported by teachers, and many council services were cut that supported LGBT families, groups, support groups, anything like that. It was a truly hideous piece of legislation, and it hasn't gone away. We've seen many protests against LGBT education over the last few years, and it's as important as ever that we remember to stand together as a community and fight this discrimination and hatred. So question number 5, a bit more of a fun one. What's the name of the 2014 film about LGSM raising money for the miners' strike? The answer is Pride. Lesbian, if you put A, Lesbian and Gay Support the Miners, that is the name of the group, LGSM, Lesbians and Gay Support the Miners, who raised money for several support groups, both in South Wales and also in Nottingham and other parts of the UK, to support striking miners in the 1980s. If you haven't seen the film, it is an absolutely fantastic film. I would highly recommend it. Please do go and check it out. It's a great film if you're interested in anything LGBT, politics or history related, a bit of something for everyone. So question 26, question 6, I got way ahead of myself then. What year was the Trade Union Act adopted, which legalised unions in the UK? It was 1871. So until this point, it was illegal to be in a trade union. And 1871 feels like a long time ago, but actually it's not that long when we think about how long human beings have been at work. And really, as long as human beings have been at work, there have been sort of informal trade unions, but prior to 1971, it was illegal. And if you've ever heard of the Toll Puddle Martyrs, they were deported to Australia for joining a trade union, and they were eventually allowed to return to the UK, but a few of them had actually died in the deportation process. So this is a huge deal, and we should be very very proud of the fact that we're allowed to organise for trade unions in this country, and the fact that governments attempt to cut away those rights is something that we should all care about very greatly. So the original Pride flag, for question number 7, created in 1978, had 3 extra colours, which are no longer on the stripes of the flag today. If you put A, pink, turquoise and indigo, you would be correct. So the original Pride flag, or the Pride flag as we know it today, is often seen with the 6 colours of red, orange, yellow, green, royal blue and violet, but it used to have hot pink, which stood for sex, turquoise, which was magic/art, and indigo, which represented serenity. There are other representations for all of the colours as well, and obviously we have updated versions of the pride flag, which includes trans and black representation as well, which is incredibly important to recognise in our community. And the final question we have is, which decade was the first strike action in support of a gay worker facing dismissal? It was in the 1970s. So in 1975, NowGo, which if you've ever heard of Unison, the trade union, the other public services union, NowGo is now a part of Unison. A senior social worker working for Tower Hamlets was sacked essentially because he was considered a jeopardy to the community. And a tribunal found that they weren't allowed to do it, but he was still fired. And so all of his co-workers immediately went on strike in support of him. So in the 1970s is the correct answer. So well done if you got several of those right. If you didn't, don't worry. I hope that you learned something. Our history is incredibly important, and I hope it gives you a bit of a taste about some of the trade union legislation that's come through as well. So I'll hand over to Stuart to talk a little bit more about that legislation and what support you can find as an LGBT worker in a trade union.
Brilliant, thanks, Keris. In a second, I'm going to hand over to Christina. What we tried to do is, one, follow on from Keris's brilliant quiz, but also see if we can pull together a little bit of information that gives an overview of the equality legislation, principally the Equality Act, but also what happens with legislation in terms of case law. So what happens when somebody goes and takes a claim to tribunal and how that shapes equality legislation. And we'll finish off with some hopefully helpful advice and tips on how you can stand up for your own rights in your workplace and make sure that you are protected as an individual worker, as a collective worker. We're going to start off with the wonderful and wide varied world of the Equality Act. And I'm going to hand over to Christine, who's going to make this incredibly exciting.
Okay, let me find my note sheet. Seconds. Okay, so a quick overview of the Equality Act. What is covered by the Equality Act, what protections it gives us, and what it doesn't for LGBT plus people. There's a strong link between the fight for LGBT plus rights and the labour movement. The first strike in support of gay workers who'd been victimised by their employer was back in the early 70s. If you've ever seen that film Pride, funnily enough mentioned in the quiz earlier, you'll know about the group Lesbian and Gay Support the Miners. The support for the striking mining community back in the early 80s saw the National Union of Miners become the first non-LGBT plus organisation to attend Pride. And if you're old enough to remember back that far or have seen the film, you'll know there was an awful lot of buses frequent London that day, and it made it one hell of a parade. In the years that followed, the NUM pushed calls for greater lesbian and gay equality through motions at Trade Union Congress, TUC and the Labour Party. However, it wasn't until 2003 that legislation was finally introduced to protect us against discrimination in employment around sexual orientation. The current legislation, known as the Equality Act 2010, brought together all anti-discrimination legislation and introduced those new protections. The legislation specifies unlawful discrimination on the 9 different grounds, of which, as we now know, thanks to Keris's quiz again, are called protected characteristics. Included in the 9 protected characteristics are sexual orientation, gender reassignment, and belief. We'll be having a look at the last one later on. Like all legislation, it isn't exactly easy to understand. Here's what the Act means. No employer can treat an LGBT person, LGBT employee or applicant differently from a straight employee or applicant simply because of their sexual orientation. No organisation delivering a service can refuse to deliver that service or give a poorer quality service to a customer simply because of their sexual orientation. Any organisation delivering a public service, for example, NHS healthcare, including businesses contracted out to deliver a public service, must consider the needs of different groups who might use that service and commit themselves to tackling any inequality. In relation to employment, the Act outlaws 4 types of behaviour in relation to the 9 protected characteristics. Obviously, these are direct discrimination, is where one person is treated less favourably than another, has been treated or would be treated in a comparable situation on the ground of their sexual orientation. Indirect discrimination, where a policy or practice is applied which disadvantages people of a particular sexual orientation, unless it can be justified as a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. Harassment is where an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive work environment is created for someone because of their sexual orientation. And victimization, where a person is treated unfavorably because of their involvement in a case or under the Equality Act, whether as a claimant, witness, or otherwise. Sounds okay, but legislation still isn't perfect. There are some exceptions and complications. First, the exceptions, and this one of those is positive. While the Equality Act doesn't routinely allow for positive discrimination, treating someone more favourably, specifically because of their specifically because of a protected characteristic, it does allow for positive action. This is where employees undertake work with particular groups to address underrepresentation of those groups in their workforce. This includes targeted recruitment, advertising, and leadership programs. Other exceptions are less clear-cut. For instance, certain occupations are not covered by the Act. For instance, religious jobs, staff working in embassies, or employment where a genuine occupational requirement. For instance, state-funded school can apply religious tests in appointing and promoting staff, promoting some of their staff. I can't get my words out tonight. Next up, omissions. Previously, an employer could be in breach of the Equality Act if they failed to take reasonable steps to prevent third-party harassment at work, where they were aware of having occurred for at least 2 occasions. The provision known as Section 40 was taken out by the government in 2013. This means employees have very limited protection where they experience discrimination in the workplace by a third party, such as a customer, visitor, or patient. The Equality Act 2010 lists gender reassignment as protected characteristic, but makes no mention of broader kinds of trans identities, such as our non-binary friends. So this brings me to the completion on this, and back to you, Stuart.
Cheers, Christine. Thank you very much. I mean, as you probably picked up from that, the Equality Act is a very strange bit of legislation, and it's not exactly the easiest to understand. And certainly, as you start to look into it, some of the language that is used is quite dated, and it really does need a bit of a rejig, if I'm being honest. It is an unusual piece of legislation because it employs not just to employment, but also to other areas. Christina talks about service provision. So basically, any company that offers a service to people should actually be covered by the Equality Act as well. And there are some high-profile cases that have come out since as a result of the Equality Act. In 2013, we had a case where hotel owners were found to have discriminated against a homosexual couple in a civil partnership because they refused to allow them to stay in a room for a double bed. That went through after the Equality Act, and it was found that they were discriminated against. On the other side of it, we had a 2016 case in Northern Ireland. This is one bakery owner who was Christian, who refused to make a cake for a homosexual customer, which included the work support gay marriage. The court decided at the end of that if the baker had actually turned around and refused point blank to offer any service to that gay couple, then that would have been discrimination. But they said it wasn't discrimination to print a cake with a message with which they profoundly disagreed with. So it was a bit of a double-edged sword. both of those two cases are pretty high profile. Most people will have seen something in the news about them. It's not always the case with claims in employment tribunals. They tend to be less well known and not as publicised as much. Just a little bit to go into the background of employment tribunals, because they are very, very different to the setup in civil courts. When you've not been able to get a successful resolution in your workplace and you've exhausted the own internal procedures, then the route for taking a legal claim against an employer for breaching employment law is through the employment tribunal system. When tribunals were first set up, they were supposed to be less formal. They were supposed to be speedy and an easy way to get a resolution. If you've been involved in any way with employment tribunals, you're going to know that that really isn't the case. They've ceased to be that quite a long time ago. They are not speedy, they are not easy to understand, and it is quite difficult to navigate your way through it. As a result of that, what has happened is that most people, when they go to tribunal, they ask for or try and seek legal representation from a lawyer, solicitor, barrister, etc. There's no requirement in the tribunal systems for you to have a lawyer or a barrister, but most people do, just because it's incredibly complicated. The but on this, of course, is that that is not cheap and that's not easy. While there is at this stage no charge for going to tribunal, we managed to succeed and get that removed as a result of the action of trade unions, so that's pretty great for us. Most people, really, if we're being honest, can't afford to get a lawyer, certainly not a barrister, to come and represent them at an employment tribunal, which is, if I'm being honest, one of the many benefits of being in a trade union. Not only will you get legal advice and support, but if we believe that you've got a claim, we will actually provide you with a lawyer, a solicitor, a barrister to actually represent you through the tribunal system, which makes it so much easier for an individual. Legislation such as the Equality Act sets out employment law, but as we've seen, it's quite often complicated and not clearly defined. It's actually employment tribunals that establish the detail about what the legislation means in practice. In kind of legalese speak, what we have is case law is the law that's made by judges when interpreting the legislation and applying it to the facts of the cases that appear before them. All that means, without the long-windedness, is that a judge will look at what the legislation says and make a determination on what they believe based on the case that comes in front of them. And there have been some pretty fundamental cases that have gone through the tribunal system that have established precedents as a result of case law. We're just going to look at a few of those, but again, let's look at some of the criticisms first of the Equality Act, because there are quite a few. While it's certainly advanced the causes of LGBT+ rights in the workplace, there are concerns that most of us have in relation to the Act. We know the Act is couched in terms that are seen as outdated and confusing, specifically with references to gender reassignment and transsexual persons. The reason we say that the focus on gender reassignment is slightly difficult is because it gives an impression that the Equality Act just means that you have to have a GRA for that discrimination to apply. That's certainly not the case. As Christina has said, the Act also makes no mention of broader kinds of sexualities or trans identities. This doesn't mean that the Equality Act doesn't give some protection to those groups who are not specifically referenced, though. And this is where case law comes into it. If we go through two of the most high profile and the most landmark cases that have gone through, let's do the good one first, and I need to be careful on my language as I go through this. In September 2020, an employment tribunal ruled in a case related to a Ms. Taylor, who was previously employed at JLR, Jaguar Land Rover. The claimant, Ms. Taylor, had worked at JLR for around about 20 years as an engineer. He'd previously presented as male, but in 2017 began identifying as gender fluid. And from that time on, they started to dress in women's clothing. In light of this, they were subjected to insults, to abusive jokes at work, and Ms. Taylor stated that she was not supported in any way as she made that transition. She experienced difficulties with the use of toilet facilities, and the general treatment from her employer. It got to the point where they felt they couldn't continue working at all. They brought a claim of harassment, direct discrimination, victimisation on the grounds of gender reassignment, as well as constructive dismissal. Constructive dismissal just means that someone thinks that things have got so bad in their employment that there is a fundamental breach of trust and confidence between them and their employer, and they leave as a direct result of that treatment. JLR, in their defence, came back and said that they didn't believe that gender fluid non-binary fell within the definition of the gender reassignment under Section 7 of the Equality Act. They lost that case, and I'm going to read the judgment, or bits of the judgment, just because it's quite beautiful and it makes me quite happy. It was an oral judgment. The tribunal unanimously upheld Ms. Taylor's claims. It held it was clear that gender is a spectrum, and that is beyond a doubt. Ms. Taylor successfully claimed direct discrimination, harassment, victimisation on the grounds of gender reassignment. So that is a real landmark case for us. While it's not specifically referenced in the Equality Act, this case law now establishes that actually this does apply, and it does apply to wider forms of trans identities and to non-binary people. Unfortunately, not all of the cases arising for the Equality Act have advanced LGBTQ+ rights. One of the most publicised and most controversial cases relates to the Maya Forstater. Forstater was a visiting fellow, which a term I'm really not academic and I still don't understand what it means, but a visiting fellow for the Centre for Global Development in Europe. I'm going to read this bit straight from the court papers because I think it's kind of important that we hear what it was actually saying in the case. They say that Forstater holds gender critical beliefs, which include the belief that sex is immutable and not to be conflated with gender identity. She engaged in debates on social media about gender identity issues, and in doing so made some remarks which some transgender people found offensive and transphobic. Some of her colleagues at work complained that they found her comments offensive, and following an investigation, her visiting fellowship was not renewed. Maya Forstater took her claim to tribunal in 2018, and they rejected her claim at that point. They said that she had not been discriminated. The tribunal judge said that Forstater's views were not worthy of respect in a democratic society. And that's something to hold in your heads until we get to the next bit. It didn't end there. There is a route for people to actually appeal decisions within the employment tribunal system, which is what Maya Forstater did. She appealed the tribunal's ruling and took it to the Employment Appeal Tribunal. She argued that the implication of the tribunal's ruling against her were profound, and that if upheld, those expressing similar views would not be protected by equality or equality law, even though they are undoubtedly serious contingent beliefs about an important aspect of human life and behaviour. Those are her words. The appeal was supported by both the Equalities and Human Rights Commission and the Index on Censorship, who both said that the tribunal's 2019 ruling was wrong and that gender critical beliefs should be a protected belief under the Equality Act. The appeal tribunal came back and found in Forstater's favour. They held that such philosophical beliefs could only be excluded from that protection where they are akin to advocating Nazism or totalitarianism, or espousing violence and hatred in the gravest of forms that should be capable of being not worthy of respect in a democratic society. It's not exactly a high benchmark. They went on to say that whereas beliefs that are offensive, shocking, or even disturbing to others, and which fall into the less grave forms of hate speech, would not be excluded from the protection of the Equality Act. So that means, in practice, that even though some beliefs may be seen as offensive and abhorrent to some, and even amount to less grave forms of hate speech, the potential for offence cannot be a reason to exclude a belief from protection under the Equality Act altogether. That's a huge amount of words there, and I'm going to try and unpick that a little bit just so we understand what that means. The success of Forstatter's appeal has been hugely and widely publicised. The rationale for the ruling, less so, but there's even more to it, which really needs to be understood to put it all into context. The EAT made it clear that the judgment doesn't mean that it was expressing any views as to the merits of either side of what they've called the transgender debate, or that any existing protections for people with protected characteristics of gender assignment were in any way undermined. Also, it considered that the judgment does not mean that employers and service providers will not be able to provide a safe environment for trans persons. The fact is that employers continue to be liable potentially for acts of harassment and discrimination against trans people committed in the course of employment. So whereas the ruling has effectively said it is not unlawful specifically to hold those beliefs, if somebody acts on those beliefs and in some way undermines, harasses or victimises a transgender person, then that would be unlawful as defined by the Act. The Forstatter case isn't over. There are still some arguments. The Employment Tribunal appeal batted it back to Tribunal to actually determine whether there's an actual connection between not renewing the contract and Forstatter's belief. And I understand there may be some other appeals in the pipeline. But the big bit to take away from that is, irrespective of the outcome, it doesn't change the fact that the Equality Act has specific protections for all of those non-protected characteristics, and there isn't a trade-off between one and the other. If somebody is a victim of discrimination, harassment or victimisation as a result of one of those protected characteristics, then the Equality Act says that it is unlawful. The Equality Act was a landmark in LGBTQ+ rights, but we still face significant issues in the workplace. We still need to push for greater and more comprehensive legislation, but we can also push for greater equality and protection within individual workplaces, irrespective of where the law sits. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next section. It's all about how you can stand up for yourself and how, with the support of organisations like a trade union, you can actually make sure that you are protected at work. So we're going to hand over a little bit for the first bit to Christina. Christina.
Back to me again. So, standing up for yourself tips if you've had issues at work. I, for one, have been one of those that's faced issues at work. So, some tips and tricks here of what I did. Obviously, most importantly, keep a diary of what's happened. Dates, times, when it happened. How did it make you feel? Who was nearby? Did you have any witnesses? Is there any evidence? Is there cameras around, especially with sound? Ideally, where possible, report it to your line manager. And if you're in a union, your union rep. If you don't feel up to this, will someone else report it for you? Do it in writing. Your workplace should have a policy in place to protect you. If so, see if you can find a copy, see what that says. File a grievance in writing to your line manager if it's a bad one, making sure you keep that paper trail. So send it by email, press that button so you get a receipt. That way, if you have to act on it in further points down the line, you've got a copy of that trail, including what happened. The most important one that I did, and it got me a lot of help and support, was join a union. Hence, I joined GMB and I'm here today.
Christina, that's absolutely perfect. Just picking up on that, most of the work in terms of unions is done by volunteers like Christina in the workplace. So that's a really great starting point. If you want to have an informal chat, and obviously if you're facing issues at work, that's one of the most important things. You just want someone who's going to listen to you and give you impartial advice on what to do. If you've got a union that's recognised within your workplace, recognition just means that they've got a rep there. They're probably going to be negotiating on policies and paying, things like that. That's the person you want to go and have a talk to. If you don't have a union in your workplace, there is no problem. Everyone has a statutory right to join a union and not face action as a result of that. If you don't have a union, I would look for one that is profoundly supportive of LGBT+ rights and actually has a good track record in supporting people. I am very biased, but that's one of the reasons I'm so proud of my own union, because of the work we do to support the LGBT plus community. It's really, really important for you as an individual just to make sure that you are doing as much as you can to actually provide yourself with protections. Like Christina said, if you're facing issues, make sure you've got a record of who's there, what's happened, and raise them. A lot of people are really scared about putting their head above a parapet and saying, hold on, I've got a bit of an issue at work. There are ways to do it informally. So like Christina said, if you're doing it through an email is kind of like a telephone conversation, but the great bit about that is you actually get a record of you raising your concerns. It's something you can rely on later on. Hopefully, if you've got an employer that's okay, they will start to look at that. And if you are in a trade union, you've got someone who will support you through that, sit alongside you. The bit for me is, as a trade union official, when things get really bad, it's when we start to look at going through formal processes, so grievances, like the formal procedure in your workplace, or if that fails, looking at options around about legal challenges. Again, it's really, really helpful if you've got somebody there that can talk you through it, advise you about courses of action, and actually guide you to support you. So again, one of the benefits of being in any trade union, not just GMB, is that you're going to have access to someone who's got an extensive experience in dealing with and supporting people in workplaces, but also is going to have a full understanding of employment law that's actually going to be guiding you through that. The only bit I'll add before I pass on to Kerry, who's got some gems about where we can take it even further, is just because something isn't unlawful as determined by in the employment legislation, it doesn't mean it's right. Yeah, employment legislation is not rarely written by working people. It's written by members of parliament, and not all of them have our interests at heart. So it means that just because somebody said to you, well, actually, you don't have a legal claim there, that's not that actually that unusual, but it doesn't mean that you don't have an issue that you need support, help, and you need your employer to take notice of. So employment law is there and it will give you some protection, but that isn't the end of it. If you feel something is wrong, then actually it's wrong, and it does need to be addressed, and you probably need a little bit of support to have conversations with your employer to start looking at different ways to actually progress it and come to a resolution that makes you feel better about what's happening or starts to address some of those issues. Kerry, over to you.
Yeah, and what Stuart said just then is so important, and particularly the point before about being in a trade union and having an extra voice is sometimes you might think, I speak to a lot of people who say things like, I understand employment law. I think if my boss tried to have a go at me, I'd feel very confident in addressing that. Now, that is fantastic. But the other thing I would always say is no matter how well you understand it, or no matter how well you think you can represent yourself, having someone else in the room with you, even if they don't say anything, is one of the most important things that you can do, that extra moral support. And you are entitled to take your trade union rep into grievance meetings, into disciplinary action meetings, and I would highly advise that as well. Being part of a trade union is about having someone in the room with you, someone who's got your back, someone that can make sure that you're not being spoken to in a particular way. And as Christina said, if you can't take your rep, or for some reason you don't feel that it's going to work in that situation, always get stuff in writing. But if we move on past sort of individual issues, potentially the other good thing about being in a trade union, and the other thing that we can do to take things forward, is look at workplaces in general and look at legislation. So I said at the beginning, my job is I'm a political and equality officer, so that's twofold for me. In my equality side, I work with groups like our LGBT group. I also work with our other, we call them strand groups in our region, that include our women workers, disabled workers, young workers, Black, Asian, minority ethnic workers, to look at different types of discrimination that those groups face in the workplace, and looking at how we can build on individual issues into wider campaigns. So just as an example, in the last few months, we've built up a menopause in the workplace toolkit. And actually, I see that Sarah is here with us tonight. Sarah is one of our activists who helped to write this, and that's fantastic. So great to see you, Sarah. This spun out of a few members basically saying that they were having issues at work, which led to conversations between those groups in regions, which led to a national conversation at GMB to build a policy and a toolkit for individuals to take into their workplaces and get their employers to sign up to say what people who experience the menopause need in their workplaces. And we have loads of toolkits like this, everything from domestic abuse to the menopause. We're currently rewriting our trans policy, and hopefully come November, we'll be launching that to look at how workplaces more generally could be more inclusive of trans workers and more supportive as well. This is the kind of work that we can do that's built up from, if you think there's an issue in your workplace that can go wider than just your workplace, this is where your trade union can really come in. And finally as well, I'm also the political officer. So sometimes we might see, as Stuart said, that the law isn't on our side. And I say sometimes, unfortunately, it's more often than not, that legislation is not in support of the employees, but in support of the employer. And there is a reason for that. And you will have seen that in many instances, that employers tend to be good friends with many politicians and other things like that as well. And it is our job as trade unions to make sure that working people have that voice and have that collected authority to say, no, we think this should be changed. So when we want to make change, we can do that not just through these toolkits and getting individual employers to sign up, but getting MPs who are friendly to our cause on our side. I'll give you an example. Our young workers group a couple of years ago thought it was completely unfair that people under the age of 25 can legally be paid less than people over the age of 25 for absolutely no reason other than they are under 25. People under the age of 25 don't have less bills, they don't have less worries, they might have families, they might have mortgages, whatever it is, there is no reason for them to be paid less. And our young members group in our region decided that they wanted to run a campaign called Wages Not Based on Ages. Now this again went to our national GMB policy, it became policy in our union, and we took it to the Labour Party, and it is now in the Labour Party's manifesto that when the Labour Party win their next election, they will abolish this policy, and that all workers from the age of 16 up will get paid a real living wage. Now this started basically from a small meeting of a couple of members who decided that something was wrong, and it hasn't yet changed in legislation, although recently the age limit has dropped down to 23. But again, I say, why do workers under the age of 23 have any less issues to deal with monetary wise than anyone over the age of 23? And this is incredible. And this is something that we can do with the strength of collective sort of voices and as a trade union as well. And it's my job to work with MPs and councillors to look at individual employers, but also look at legislation, look at what we need to be doing, what campaigns can we do to make sure that working people, especially from protected groups, have that extra authority, have that right to say no, no more. So if you aren't in a trade union and you're thinking about joining one, please do check it out. If you are in a trade union and you want to get more involved, I would recommend emailing your regional office. And if you're in GMB, you can call us on 0121 550 4888 to get involved in our networks. And see what campaigns we can run to make the lives of working people better day in, day out. And I'll say it, we can change legislation and that will make it different for people across the country, but you can make changes in your workplace every day just by being a member of a trade union and just by giving the space to other people to come to you to say, I have a problem, let's change this together. We're going to do it. We're going to fight everything that we have fought for, and we have won from the minimum wage to the weekend. We have not been handed anything for free. We have fought for all of those things, and everything else that we will win, we will get through the struggle together. So thank you so much for tuning in. I'll just make sure that Stuart and Christina don't have anything to say before we take questions, and then we'll open the floor up to anyone who wants to ask us anything about employment issues or any campaigns that they want to get involved in. So Stuart or Christina, is there anything else you want to add?
I was just going to say, Carrie, that was a barnstorming end on that. I wish I could fire on all cylinders like that. Plus, I think we are going to have to get our phone number in a jingle, and you're going to have to sing it because that was quite good. 0121 550 4888. Well done.
I feel like you've already been working on that. That worries me. But,
if she's singing
I'll let
it,
it slide.
If Caris is singing it, are you doing the musical entourage for it, Stu?
I think that's the plan. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat or in the Facebook comments. And if you're watching this after the fact as well, I recommend, if you are a member of a trade union, getting in touch with your trade union if you've got any issues or questions that you want to get answered. So I'll just give it a few minutes or so in case anyone does have anything they want to ask. Or I'm assuming that anyone on the Zoom call can obviously just kind of unmute themselves and ask that question as well if they've got anything that they want.
I've just realised as well, because we're on the Zoom, if you want to put your little handy icon up, a hand icon up, we can probably see it from that, or just shout out. I think it's probably easier. Sarah.
I thought I'd jump straight in there. I just want to say brilliant webinar, Zoom meeting, by the way. It's really, really good. As Kerry said, yeah, I'm a GMB activist as well. And as someone who's a straight cis woman, what tips would you have for people like myself who are allies of our LGBT plus community, as to what we can do in the workplace as well to make lives better for our LGBT siblings, and also what tips would you give to anyone out there who wants to know more and how to educate themselves so that we understand a little bit more about the struggles and the issues that people from these communities are faced with?
You know, that's a great question, Sarah. Thank you. Stuart, did you want to start?
I'll do the first bit, and I think one of the great things is by doing something like this, actually coming along and listening to people, because that's essentially it for anyone who is an ally or wants to be an ally. It's actually listening to the people that are going to be affected by issues. So certainly within big employers, a lot of big employers now have gone, it does feel a little bit tick boxy, but have gone and set up groups of marginalised workers. Certainly some of the big organisations have LGBTQ plus groups within their own employment bits. I think sometimes though, workers from marginalised groups tend to be less confident in coming forward in taking on positions outside of those groups. So I think one of the great ways of being an ally is actually getting involved with those groups, going along and saying, actually, what are the issues you're facing? What can we do from outside that community to come along and support you? But like I say, first step is doing something like this, amplifying people's voices is brilliant. I don't know if Christine, Kerry, if you want to say anything on that.
So I'm going to come in on that one as well. So obviously another thing is, like I said earlier, when there's issues happening, be there for the person. If need be that person for them that goes to report it.
Definitely. And finally, all I was going to say as well is echo what Stuart said about active listening and creating a space and a platform is recognizing your own privilege and not getting in the way of those things, you know, where there may be spaces where there are LGBT workers or members who are trying to talk about their experiences, making sure that you call out any kind of direct or indirect homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, whatever it else it be, you know, making sure that you are there to do that. I know there have been times where I've been in spaces where I've experienced, you know, biphobia, and it's disappointed me that my straight colleagues who I know are allies have never said anything. And I think that that is one of the most important things that you can do is don't just call yourself an ally, step up to the plate and, you know, be there in that situation as well. I think that that's incredibly important. So listening, learning, getting involved, but also using your privilege where you have the opportunity to. And in terms of your question of, you know, how do you learn, how do you expand your knowledge? And I think that extends to all of us in the community as well. You know, I don't know everything about every other aspect of being LGBTQ+. It's always a learning curve, language changes constantly. I would just recommend reading, you know, books written by LGBT+ people, listening to podcasts, checking out events like this at GMB West Midlands. We have our LGBT group that is closed to LGBT workers, but we also put on events throughout the year that are open to everyone. There are educational events for people to come along and listen and learn, you know, ask questions. There is always a time and a place, I think, for certain questions, but I think in most cases, people do just want you to be aware of those situations as well. And I'd also, you know, things like putting your pronouns in your bio and stuff and making those things normal parts of everyday conversations, I think is incredibly important and supportive as well, because I went to a talk a couple of months ago where somebody said, you know, it's all well and good to ask people's pronouns when you make assumptions about the fact that they are trans. And that actually makes it worse, because what you're basically doing is saying, oh, I feel like I need to ask your pronouns because I'm not sure what they are. So making it a constant conversational piece is one of the ways that we can really make that, you know, part of everyday discussion. And I think that's something that cis straight people can really do, and actually cis people in general. I'm not just talking about our heterosexual allies. I think all of us in the community can do that job to make that space a little bit more welcoming and a little bit more open.
Have we got any other questions or anybody want to ask anything while we're on? As long as it's not too hard, because I've already failed on the protected characteristics. Dean, have you got a question for us?
Yeah, I've got a couple of things actually, things that I've always wondered about or experienced myself. First thing actually is an observation though. I think a lot of bigger companies do a lot of the stuff for the Stonewall employers list. Bit of a song and dance, bit of a, you know, all for the PR. And I think there's also a thing of like, I have this thing about sort of urban and rural, and I think it's the same kind of thing, that head office is often a lot more on the case and on the ball than the devolved units around. I had an experience working for a county council, and head office was really on the ball and very, very hot on everything. But you get to the frozen north where I was, and you know, nothing much. And I think there's something there for, like, you know, line managers in the provinces, if you like, for whatever, want of a better word, don't get the same kind of discussions, training. I don't know if that's something unions can get involved in, but it's definitely, you know, so you end up with a picture where the company has this sort of stonewall, Ujima, we are number whatever on the list, and all looking great, and it comes around on the company intranet. And then you're like, yeah, but I was misgendered just the other day, and, you know, it kind of, I said something and somebody got really cross with me, and, you know, it's kind of like it doesn't play out in terms of policies on the ground. I think that's you know, that's something for everyone to be aware of. So that's more of an observation, but I kind of, an earlier experience in my life, had issues with someone else who was also in the union and was extremely close friends with the union rep, and et cetera, and et cetera. And it felt like, okay, I'm not going to get anywhere with this. It was like a boys' club together. What would you suggest for someone in that situation? What would you do? Go to another branch? Or, you know, in the end, things moved in a different direction anyway. But yeah, what would you suggest in that kind of, because there is a bit of a cliquey thing sometimes with people who, whatever group it is, you know, they clump together, they're all mates. And yeah, what would you suggest?
I don't mind doing the first bit on this. I think those are such, the observation, and actually I think the question are kind of not a million miles away from each other in some respects. I did a lot of work back when I had a proper job as an organizer with a large utility company, and again, their head office was rainbowed up and singing and all dancing. And when you got out, started talking to field engineers, so these basically people who work out in the field fixing. I'm not going to go. I was going to say the name of the company then, but they're actually at it in the field. Their experience was completely different, and certainly those workers from marginalised groups did not feel that they were working for an organisation that espoused those values that really protected them. And I think unions in some ways have a little bit of that themselves. There's a danger that we end up as, like you say, little cliques or groups, and we don't actually look like the people that we are trying to represent. I think on both of those examples, there is a kind of lesson for everyone. In terms of the first bit, it's the job of a trade union to make sure that we are actually supporting everyone that comes forward, everyone who wants to be a member or is a member. So if there is a big organisation and the values of that organisation espouses aren't happening, then it's for us to actually try and adapt and change the culture of that organisation. It's no good having something that is driven top down. It has to come from the bottom up, and that's the great thing about a trade union. We should be driven bottom up. But the other bit for us, and I think that's the really important bit, what happens if our bottom up bit doesn't feel like it's working either? And I think that's the bit that things like this really, really helpful, because what we want to do is actually encourage people who aren't well represented in our organisation, certainly, to come forward and say, you know what, actually, I would like to be a voice for people in my employer. I would like to be that person that stands up. So if there is a trade union rep and you think, actually, I'm not sure that's going to work for me, it's for whatever reason that I don't feel that person is able to represent me or just doesn't represent me, then I'd say, actually come and have a chat with us, because it may be that you or someone you know are that person who would be a better fit for you and your colleagues, who was going to be the person that actually is going to act like your voice a little bit better. And like I said, that's the benefits of doing it through an organisation like ours. You can actually go and speak to a regional official or a branch official and say, hold on, I'd like to see if I can actually get a little bit more involved. I'd like to see if I can be the voice for people who haven't got a voice in my workplace. It's in our interest to get that right as much as it is for our individual members, because if we get it right, it means we're becoming effective, we're building a stronger voice for everyone who's part of our union. Did that answer that, or was it a long-winded way of saying?
It slightly did. It said, if you need representation, but the local rep it doesn't appear to be somebody who would be helpful become the rep, which is helpful to a point, but then it isn't, because what if you just need some help with your problem at work?
What you can do, and again, the benefits of a trade union, and Kerry's going to come in a minute, is that you can go actually and speak to a regional official. If it actually, right. I'm not sure this person here on the ground who's representing me, go and have a chat with someone like me or Kerry's, or even Christina at a different level. There's going to be someone else who can pick it up. And also, if you want, because again, being a trade union rep is not easy. It's not something that everyone can do. So even if you feel quite strong and powerful, you might not feel confident enough to actually go and speak to managers about that. So if you aren't the person you think is going to be the best voice, but you know who somebody who is, and it's normally the person who is a little bit gobby, who doesn't mind actually putting their head up and their hand up and saying, oh, hold on, I'm not sure this is right. That's the bit, give them a gentle push and say, you know what, you'd be really good. But if you don't get an answer from the person you're speaking to, come and speak to someone else.
And I was just going to add on to that, if that's all right, Dean, that's the other thing about our regional structures as well. So Christina, along with one of our other colleagues, and our lay member representatives on what we have in GMB is our regional equality forum. And basically that group looks at what campaigns we should be doing at an intersectional level with other groups as well. But our LGBT group in the region looks at campaigns. And, you know, I've talked about those. They're not just outside the organisation. You know, we're not just looking at changing legislation for workers in workplaces. Those campaigns are also about our own union. So just to give you an example that's unrelated, our women's group a few years ago wanted to run a period poverty campaign. And the first thing they said is, we think it's outrageous that GMB itself does not provide free sanitary products in toilets, and now we do. So, you know, that is a campaign that started by looking at GMB and saying, well, before we can step out onto the plate and say, oh, everyone else should be doing this, we need to look at what we're actually doing. So, you know, these groups are a space for you to come and say, well, actually, I think we need to do a campaign around educating reps on LGBT plus issues, because I think there are multiple reps that have, you know, homophobic or transphobic tendencies or whatever it may be. Now, first of all, may I say that where we have reps that are homophobic or transphobic or whatever it may be, that is an issue that we need to deal with. So I would always recommend coming to your officer, because that's not something that any of us should just let slide. So I would really recommend coming to a regional office, and you can always talk to, if you're in GMB, you can always talk to me as the equality officer, and it can be anonymous. It can be however you want to do. If you just want to have a conversation about how you might handle that, or you can, like Stuart said, go to your regional officer, or Stuart's a senior official. So if you feel like it needs to go even higher, or you can contact your regional secretary, and that goes for anybody watching this in a different union or in a different part of the country. That goes for you as well. But also look at the campaigns that we can be running. Are they educational? Should we be holding events? You know, if you think that it should be compulsory for all reps to have to undergo, I don't know, some kind of trans awareness training before they're allowed to become reps, you know, you can put that forward to us. That is definitely something that we, you know, can take on board and have a look at. But it all comes from our membership. The point, as Stuart said, of us is being lay member led. And if you feel that the union is not doing something, then, you know, you can tell us. We're really happy to change that. And, you know, we want our union, and I'm speaking, you know, from my own personal point of view as well. I want to be proud of the union that we're a part of. I want to know that everybody that, you know, proudly says that they're GMB knows that they are welcome and comfortable. And if there are people that are not allowing that to happen, then that needs to be dealt with. So I hope that answers it a little bit as well. But also, yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you so much for your question.
Sarah.
If I unmute, it may help if I unmute myself. I just wanted to come back on the point that Kerry was just making about being fully inclusive. So like you spoke about the menopause work that we've done as a union, we've made sure that that's really inclusive by talking to our trans and non-binary working group as well from national level, so right across all the regions, to make sure that when we're talking about issues such as the menopause or period poverty and things like that, we're not just looking at cis women, we're also looking at potentially trans men and non-binary folk and gender fluid people who may experience those, what people would stereotypically say is a cis women's issue. It's making sure that we're not assuming that we know the right thing for everyone else. And I think that comes back to, like you say, the education and learning yourself. I mean, I've learned so much from Christina. She's just an absolutely amazing oracle. I can't say anything better than that. but it's not assuming that just because you're educated, you know what people want. You need to go out and talk to those groups of workers as well. So I just wanted to add that in, that's one thing that I'm really proud of as a GMB member, that we are fully inclusive with all of our policies, or trying to get there to become fully inclusive. So hope that, Dean, gives you a little bit of a little bit more of I'll try to think of the word, credibility to your question.
Perfect. Are we okay for time, Healy?
I think we've run over a little bit.
Yeah, it's just 8 o'clock. Yeah, it's a little bit over, but just perfect. It's all
Perfect.
ready.
Just before Kerry wraps up, have we got any other questions, or anybody else want to ask anything while we're on? I know it's been fabulous, by the way. You've all been brilliant. Oh, Dean.
Sorry, I did have one other quick question. Sorry, Healy. Sorry, everyone. I hope it's a quick one. Customer service. I worked in customer service. It's, you know, public facing role. Colleagues just about got on board with pronouns and things, although for some of them it was hard. Got misgendered continually at the counter, continually. And it was made fairly clear to me that I wasn't supposed to say anything to customers, and the interactions were fairly short, to be fair. But it did wear me down over time. And I noted that Christina said there was some kind of, you know, exception in the legislation. I just wondered, what advice is there for people in a customer facing role?
Perfect. I don't mind doing the first bit on this, and then it might be worth looking at see what Christina says on it. You're absolutely right. Like Christina said, the Equality Act, when it was first brought in, it had a provision about third-party harassment, and third-party just means that your employer still had a legal duty to stop or to protect you from discrimination from customers, from visitors or patients. That was removed by the Conservative Party when they got into power, so they effectively took that away. So while it's not specifically unlawful, your employer still has a legal responsibility to ensure that you are not the victim of any form of harassment or victimization at work. So I would expect an employer to actually, one, look at doing a risk assessment for front-facing, customer-facing roles, to say, actually, what is the likelihood you're going to come across this kind of behavior? And once they've identified, then look at practical measures, safety measures that are actually going to go and support you in place. So even if that's on, and again, you know, there are lots of different roles that come into some fairly serious kinds of abuse, and that has kind of wrapped up into the role, social workers, etc., teaching assistants. It still doesn't mean that you have to just experience that. There should be safety measures, and also it goes into the bit about, okay, if you are going to experience some of that, what can we put in place that actually means that you are not going to suffer mental illness as a result of that? Let's be kind of blunt on it. So they should be looking at what support services are going to be able to do it, what they can do if there's an issue that arises, how do you escalate a concern, how do you actually record it? Because I know that certainly customer service roles, lots of employees are really bad at just actually recording when things like that happens. So you can't understand how to fix something if you don't know how often it's happening or what the severity is. So as a very, very minimum, there should be a risk assessment that says, this is what we can do to support you, this is what we can put in place, and more specifically, this is how you record those incidences and pass them on. But yeah, like I say, the actual legislation removed that bit, but it doesn't take away from the kind of legal responsibilities of an employer. Christine or Kerry, have I missed anything on that?
No, I'll come in on that one super quick. Obviously, for a living, I work in a customer service facing role, funnily enough, and have been through a very similar situation in my workplace. And obviously, being a union member, being a union recognised workplace, we have a zero tolerance policy in place. I'm lucky to have a very nice new store manager who's been with me about a year, who, if she hears so much as a mispronoun, she is on that customer's backside, excuse my language there, big time, and literally they're warned, if you do it again, that's you out the door and you won't be getting your shopping. So it is worth reporting it. It is worth talking to your bosses and colleagues.
I think we have to end the session now. So I'll just very quickly say thank you so much to everyone that's come along. Thank you for your questions. Thank you if you've tuned in on Facebook as well. We really, really appreciate being allowed to come along to Warwickshire Pride. And we love Warwickshire Pride at GMB. It's one of our favourite prides that we get to go to. We always get great feedback from our members who attend. So thank you as well to Dan and to Healy for all of the work that you guys do and you folks do at Warwickshire Pride as well. So just my final thought would be, please join a union, get involved, get active, and you know, let's change the world.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Healy. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Cheers.